Okay, it is currently 15th of July, 2025, and today I'm going to be taking a look at chapter 3 of Jung's psychological types on the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which is a further exploration of the same problem, Jung's way of approaching the split in the Western psyche in terms of typology. The context for this is the my existing series on psychological types, and I might recommend that one listens to the first 5 minutes of the second video in the series, Psychological Types, Chapter 1, Part 2, for a very brief overview of what fundamental pairs of opposites are being worked with here. It basically has to do with rational and irrational, or abstraction and sensation, and for Jung, also introversion and extroversion. And in Chapter 2, he was talking about that in terms of someone named Schiller who perceived the same problem. And Jung moved into a discussion of kind of conscious and unconscious and the transcendent function that mediates between them. And so we were talking about the self and the mandala as a symbol of the self, and the importance of symbols for Jung in mediating this split in the Western psyche. And so today we're moving on with the same problem. Again, it's Jung looking at the split in the Western psyche in terms of typology and seeing how this um, discussion, this perception of the split has changed over time. And Jung is going to use now Nietzsche to talk about how the problem has changed from Schiller to Nietzsche, essentially. And so we know from Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy that like one of the initial and primary distinctions in Nietzsche is between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And so Jung is going to offer an interpretation of what these terms mean in Nietzsche's thought, and then relate them to his own typological system, namely in terms of introversion and extroversion. And that is going to allow Jung to clarify um, um, sensation and intuition, which he hasn't really talked about in detail yet. So again, for Jung, we have these like two types of people, the introvert and the extrovert, where for the introvert, the energy flows toward the subject, and the extrovert, where the energy flows toward the object. And for people within either of those types, Jung talks about them having different cognitive functions, namely thinking and feeling functions, and the functions of sensation and intuition. And it's that latter pair that are going to be clarified and explicated by this discussion of Nietzsche. And so to place this into historical context, we know that both Nietzsche and Jung were deeply influenced by Schopenhauer, who um, was quite interested in Oriental philosophy. And so Schopenhauer is sort of importing um, some Eastern concepts into German idealism, which then became embedded in Nietzsche and Jung. Um, that's important because for Nietzsche, he was sort of there's a like Jung claims, this is from page 136 to 146 in Psychological Types. Like Jung is saying of Nietzsche that Nietzsche was sort of felt a pull toward the East in recognition of the decline of Western culture. And he felt that pull through Schopenhauer, but that Nietzsche then felt that that pull stopped in Greece. So Nietzsche became very concerned with Greek culture and the study of the pre-Socratics and the Socratics, Plato and Aristotle and so on. Um, but Jung says that um, Nietzsche's conception of the Greek character is quite a lot darker than uh, the perception of that character by Schopenhauer. And so he quotes from Nietzsche: "In order to make life possible, the Greeks had to create those gods from sheer necessity. They knew and felt the terror and frightfulness of existence. To be able to live at all, the Greeks had to interpose the shining, dream-born Olympian world between themselves and that dread, that tremendous mistrust of the titanic powers of nature, Moira pitilessly enthroned above all knowledge, the vulture of Prometheus, the great friend of man, the awful fate of the wise Oedipus, the family curse of the Atreides that drove Orestes to matricide. All this dread was ever being conquered anew by the Greeks with the help of that visionary intermediate world of the Olympians, or was at least veiled and withdrawn from sight. And so just to clarify what he's talking about here, um, Moira, the term Moira refers to the three fates, which we know from Greek mythology. There's a sort of, they're enthroned in a certain way above all knowledge in Greek mythology. Um, Furthermore, Prometheus, like the man who brought fire to mankind, is sort of chained to a rock, and a vulture is like ripping out his liver. It's a very horrible fate in a way. Oedipus killed his father, married his own mother, another horrible fate. The family curse of the Atreides, which we see drawn into Frank Herbert's Dune series. Family curse of the Atreides originated with the curse of Atreus, the origin of which came from the hubris of a king named Tantalus, and it precipitated a recurring cycle of familial violence, which culminated in the Trojan War. So the curse of Atreus, not not pretty. So this is all different elements of the terrible quality in Greek culture perceived by Nietzsche, where he's sort of claiming that the mythological and religious establishment of the Greek Olympian world is a kind of counterposition. It's kind of compensating for the ugliness and brutality of the natural state that the Greeks felt. And so what's present for me here is this dialectic between, yeah, finitude and transcendence, where there's like this opponent processing again between the actuality or necessity of the Greeks' actual lives and um, the possibility that was implied by their perception of transcendence, namely the Olympian world. And so what Nietzsche is perceiving here, and by extension Jung, is this dark underbelly of Greek culture, that the higher versions, namely the Apollonian versions of what the Greeks would, the Apollonian side of what the Greeks were talking about, is a kind of compensation of that. Yeah, quite the tremendous mistrust of the titanic powers of nature. And so this is like they're perceiving a dichotomy which is cutting right to the core of Greek culture. And that allows um, Jung to say that Nietzsche's standpoint here is very different than that of Schiller's, which we were talking about in relation with chapter 2. Although um, yeah, both of them speak in aesthetic terms. And so there's a way that Schiller and Nietzsche both perceive the mediation or remediation of this split in aesthetic terms. And Jung is going to criticize that in a minute. But just to say for the moment that this perception of this deep contrast in Greek culture perceived by Nietzsche allows us to clarify like each of those poles in terms of Apollonian and Dionysian. And we're going to try and explicate what that polarity means, or at least what Jung perceives that polarity to mean in Nietzsche. And so he quotes Nietzsche to draw this out. And I quote, this is from Nietzsche: "We shall have gained much for the science of aesthetics when once we have perceived not only by logical inference, but by the immediate certainty of intuition, that the continuous development of art is bound up with the duality of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, in much the same way as generation depends on the duality of the sexes, involving perpetual conflicts with only periodic reconciliations. From the two deities of the arts, Apollo and Dionysus, we derive our knowledge that a tremendous opposition existed in the Greek world, both as to their origin and their aim, between the Apollonian art of the shaper and the non-figurative Dionysian art of music. These two very different impulses run side by side, for the most part openly at variance, each continually rousing the other to new and mightier births, in order to perpetuate in them the warring antagonism that is only seemingly bridged by the common term art, until finally, by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will, they appear paired one with the other. And from this mating, the equally Apollonian and Dionysian creation of Attic tragedy is at last brought to birth. Again, this is from Nietzsche about the birth of tragedy. And so this quote is going to be key for what follows from Jung. There's a way that, so he's saying that there's this deep difference between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which again, we're going to unpack more. And the art is something which only seems to reconcile the two. Um, and what actually reconciles them is a kind of, quote, metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will, by which these Apollonian and Dionysian sides are paired with one another. And the product of that is, according to Nietzsche, the birth of tragedy. And so we can see from this how influenced Jung is by Nietzsche in his prioritization of the will, in directing the conscious will toward the unconscious in order to unveil, uncover the transcendent function using symbolic terms. Anyway, let's go on with Nietzsche. How does Nietzsche compare or contrast the states referred to by the Apollonian and the Dionysian? This is from page 138. And so Nietzsche compares the peculiar psychological states they give rise to with those of dreaming and intoxication. So dreaming has more to do with Apollonian, and intoxication has to do more with the Dionysian. And so what does Nietzsche mean by dreaming? He means a kind of inward vision, a lovely semblance of dream worlds. Apollo rules over the beautiful illusion of the inner world of fantasy. He is the god of all shape-shifting powers. Yeah, he signifies measure, number, limitation, and subjugation of everything wild and untamed. And so this is like this, it's a quality of introverted peace and ordering. It's very hard to draw out what exactly is meant by this distinction, but anyway, that will do. That, and by contrast, the Dionysian impulse, on the other hand, quote, means the liberation of unbounded instinct, the breaking loose of the unbridled dynamism of animal and divine nature. Hence, in the Dionysian rout, man appears as a satyr, God above and God below. The Dionysian is the horror of the annihilation of the principium individuationis, and at the same time rapturous delight in its destruction. So it's equivalent to intoxication in some terms. So we can see how here the Apollonian is far more connected with fantasy and detachment and going up into the abstract and away into thinking, whereas the Dionysian is far more connected with horror and feeling and the sensuous and going down into the actual, into destruction rather than creation, and intoxication and sort of ecstatic revelry rather than in peaceful dreaming. Yeah, and so importantly, the Dionysian is characterized by this like pre-Greek, like we could say pre-Socratic paganism, where there are like characteristically Dionysian orgies, where like archetypally Dionysus has his group of nymphs or satyrs, and he hangs out with them, and they get intoxicated um, and do orgies. That's what they get up to. And so this is a very Dionysian. mm, it's a symbol of the Dionysian and a very Dionysian thing to do. Yeah, and so there's a way that individuality is compromised by this. It's kind of like this, like imagine full moon mushroom rituals. So like group psychedelic states of merging of the individual with the collective. So there's a way that Each feels himself not only united, reconciled, merged with his neighbor, but one with him. His individuality is entirely obliterated. Man is no longer the artist, he has become the work of art. This is the kind of Dionysian state. Yeah, and importantly, this is connected with Jung's distinction of the conscious and the unconscious, where in this Dionysian state of yeah, mystical experience, mystical union with the other, with nature and with each other, um, the this means that the creative dynamism, libido in instinctive form, takes possession of the individual as though he were an object and uses him as a tool or as an expression of itself. So individuality is lost, and along with it, the rational will, the agency. And so there's a way that in the Dionysian ecstatic, intoxicated condition, nature or the unconscious works through one and is in control of the flow of energy and life forces. Yeah, and so the consequence of this is that in this Dionysian state, insofar as the natural creature is decidedly not a work of art in the ordinary sense of the word, he's nothing but sheer nature, unbridled, a raging torrent, not even an animal that is restricted to itself and the laws of its being. Yeah, Nietzsche goes on, practically everywhere, the central point of these festivals, meaning Dionysian festivals, lay in exuberant sexual license, which swamped all family life and its venerable traditions. The most savage bestialities of nature were unleashed, including that atrocious amalgam of lust and cruelty, which has always seemed to me the true witch's broth. And so we can see here there's a very sharp contrast between this kind of Dionysian condition and the world of Greek theater and sculpture and artistry in general. Like it's the sophistication of uh, Greek culture as we generally know it in terms of ancient Greece is far more geared toward the Apollonian side, and there's this kind of dark underbelly of the Dionysian, which is maybe not as obvious to us as moderns in perceiving the Greeks. At least so they sort of imply, Nietzsche and Jung. And importantly, they focus here on the Delphic oracle. I'm just going to clarify this. Yeah, so the important point here is that the Oracle of Delphi, which we know as the sort of one of the bedrocks of Greek culture, where some kind of psychedelic substance was served to all of the major players of ancient Greek culture, including Plato and Aristotle, I think Empedocles and Sophocles as well. Um, there's a big deal. There's like the um, yeah the Delphic oracle. Importantly, that oracle is in a temple to Apollo. So there's a way that this I mean, and this like the Oracle of Delphi is kind of all the rage at the moment in the psychedelic world as the psychedelic renaissance sweeps over Western culture, and we rediscover that the roots of Greek culture have to do with this. There's a way that in Nietzsche, this Delphic oracle in a temple to Apollo is a kind of natural reconciliation of these Apollonian and Dionysian aspects in Greek culture. And so Nietzsche sees the Delphic oracle as a kind of symbol of the reconciliation of these opposites. Um, Jung points out that he kind of forgets his own qualification from earlier, which is that there's a way that this is um, an illusory reconciliation. So it's a kind of it's too aesthetic or artistic, and it sort of covers over this deep split in the Greek psyche. So there's a way that the Delphic oracle seems to be reconciling the Apollonian and Dionysian, but is not actually doing so. Jung says, by this token, the reconciliation of Apollo and Dionysus would be a beautiful illusion, a desideratum evoked by the need of the civilized Greek in his struggle with his own barbarian side, the very element that broke out unchecked in the Dionysian rout. And so, like Jung describes how, like, There's always an actual condition of the people and then the religion and the qualities that that religion points to. So Jung's pointing to the compensatory function of religion, which gives it a practical significance. So he describes this difference in the Persian way of life and, for example, in the Christian era, when this quote religion of love assisted in the greatest bloodbath in the world's history. And Jung takes from that the inference that the symbol of the Delphic reconciliation of Apollonian and Dionysian points to an especially violent split in the Greek character. Um, he claims that this would also explain the longing for deliverance, this kind of the um, anagogic ascent up and out of Plato's cave toward the transcendent good or the transcendentals, the true good and the beautiful, is sort of symptomatic in some way of this pre-existing violent split in the Greek character. Um, and certainly, I would also, I mean, for my own part, it's not that, I'm again following Viveki in the sense that there's a great deal for us to learn from ancient Greek culture, a lot for us to emulate and try to reverse engineer in the sense of the Platonic Academy and Pythagorean mystery school content and dialectic into dialogos and all the rest of it, the practice of philosophy. But the idea is that, again, this is taking from the sociological argument that I was making earlier. By the time we get to Greek culture, there's already agrarianism. We've already lost the uh, like this deep interrelationship between mythos and logos that form the functionality of shamanism that I would say properly unify the the Dionysian flow of energy with the forms, the symbolic forms through which that energy flows to make that flow well ordered. And so I really do agree that this split is already obtaining in Greek character, and it's in large part due to the way that those people chose to live. And so this Jung goes on to say that this deep split is also very overlooked by early admirers of the Greek world. And we can say still overlooked today, where we don't want to naively attribute to the Greeks everything that we ourselves lack. So we can see, for example, that in in the conversion from the pre-Socratic to the Socratic kind of time, the mystery schools, sort of epitomized by Pythagoras and others, were very much repressed. Like there is this liminal, countercultural, sociological form that is reflected in the psychology of the people who are running that kind of sociological model, and that ends up being violently repressed, much as like the Christian repression of paganism and the like. It's kind of this way that this Apollonian or kind of it, like excessively civilized Apollonian side, quote, has already achieved a certain amount of domestication. And that means that there's a way that this split manifests in the repression of the sort of dark underbelly that is then, repressed and it becomes quite violent. So Jung says, to the Apollonian side, which had already achieved a certain amount of domestication, this intoxicated state that made man forget both himself and his humanity and turned him into a mere creature of instinct must have been altogether despicable. And for this reason, a violent conflict between the two impulses was bound to break out. Hmm. The dammed up instinctual forces of civilized man are immensely destructive and far more dangerous than the instincts of the primitive, who in a modest degree is constantly living out his negative instinct. Hmm. Yeah, and so there's this way that there's this excessive civilization that leads to these extremely violent um, repressions, which we can see in this there's a claim that the that war committed by civilized nations is like more horrifying or worse in some way because of this condition. Like this split has already established and then grows because uh, if there's no natural outlet, if there's no safe way for the Dionysian side to express itself, then tries to escape, and the Apollonian sort of pushes it down and really doesn't like it to be there, both within people and in the social forms that are present. Importantly, they Jung claims that both Nietzsche and Schiller sort of talk about, again, art as a kind of seeming to reconcile the Apollonian and Dionysian, but they're not actually doing so. So there's a way that they they conceive of the solution as aesthetic or artistic. And because it's a solution which, according to Jung, doesn't really work, this problem of this split then kind of remains stuck in aesthetics. Um, so Jung claims that we essentially beauty is kind of one-sided, or like aesthetics or artistry is kind of one-sided in the sense that we also need like ugliness. So it's again, this is Jung. This is kind of the shadow integration aspect of Jungian psychology. It's by being with our dark side and allowing it space through us and not repressing it, but acknowledging its value and importance, that the split can be reconciled. And so the aesthetic focus on beauty at the expense of ugliness seems to reify or deepen the split even further rather than repair it. And so Jung says that because Nietzsche kind of forgot about this, like he also gave aesthetics um, an important role. Jung claims that Nietzsche kind of forgets that the the depth of this problem of reconciliation was not ultimately an aesthetic problem, but a religious problem. So, like for example, we can see with the goes on. This is page 141. We're talking about like the Dionysian, and so Jung says the Dionysian satyr festival, to judge by all the analogies, was a kind of totem feast involving a regressive identification with the mythical ancestors or directly with the totem animal. Yeah, the cult of Dionysus had in many places a mystical and speculative streak, and in any case exercised a very strong religious influence. What we're getting at here is that this distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian is not an aesthetic difference. It's a difference in metaphysics. It's a difference in a deep way of life. It's a difference in the religious conception of who we are and what is reality and how ought we to live. We can see how the Dionysians come straight out of the indigenous and shamanic tradition. Yeah, and so Jung says aestheticism is a modern bias that shows the psychological mysteries of the Dionysus cult in a light in which they were assuredly never seen or experienced by the ancients. But then the obvious question is, why would Nietzsche and Schiller both do this? Like if it's clearly not an aesthetic problem, why would they regard it as such? And Jung gives the obvious answer that this aesthetic approach, this is page 142, converts the problem into a picture, which the spectator can contemplate at his ease, admiring both its beauty and its ugliness, merely re-experiencing its passions at a safe distance, with no danger of becoming involved in them. The aesthetic attitude guards against any real participation. Yeah, so there's a kind of watching this problem over there and like regarding it from over here. And so there's a non-participation that this aesthetic attitude implies. That means that like both Schiller and Nietzsche can keep the problem at a safe distance and be uninvolved in it. Um, yeah, and so this, but importantly, like it is a religious problem, and it's kind of there's that participation in the depths of the problem is kind of unavoidable, existentially speaking, which is kind of exactly what happened to Nietzsche. So it, the spirit of Dionysus kind of very much took its revenge upon Nietzsche in driving him into insanity. Um, yeah, and so Jung goes on. It's a little tricky here. So there's a way that again Nietzsche's position changes over time. So in when Nietzsche writes his first book, Birth of Tragedy, he's speaking from Like he's in from coming from the point of view that aestheticism is the kind of solution. Whereas by the time that he writes uh, Thus Spake Zarathustra, he's much more of a Dionysian. And so, like, this is what allows Jung to say that Nietzsche had a very profound grasp of the problem, even though he has sort of aesthetic defenses against participating in that problem until it was kind of too late. And so there's a way that his um, Nietzsche's later Dionysian experience um, and tragedy like seems almost an inevitable consequence of that attitude that he brought to bear. Yeah, and so like because it's that like even though Nietzsche was began as let's say regarding aestheticism as a kind of solution, um, he was still able to deeply attack Socrates in the birth of tragedy, um, f from the point of view of like aiming at a critique of rationalism. So like he sort of Nietzsche sort of arguing that Socrates is impervious to Dionysian orgiastics. Um, and so this it's because of Nietzsche's insight into this problem that he can argue this. Yeah, so that, like Nietzsche's criticizing Socrates for kind of holding himself aloof from the problem, which is exactly the same mistake that Nietzsche then makes. Yeah, and so Jung says that like even at that time, in spite of Nietzsche's aestheticism, he still had an inkling of the real solution, which he um, talks about in terms of quote a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will that was able to reconcile these two, Apollonian and Dionysian. And obviously, because Nietzsche is very influenced by Schopenhauer, this is it may well we can interpret that as a reference to the kind of metaphysical will, which to Jung means unconscious. And so, like in Jung's terms, it basically what it means is that the solution to the problem is a kind of unconscious miracle. And so that's what allows us to bridge from Nietzsche's solution to the problem, namely moving from the aesthetic reconciliation, in terms of the Delphic reconciliation of Apollonian and Dionysian, to a response which is based on an act of will, a miraculous act of will in some kind, which to Jung is a kind of unconscious miracle, an unconscious act of will in some way that can reconcile this deep split in the Western psyche. And so Jung quotes, um, this is from Jung. If then we replace metaphysical in Nietzsche's formula by unconscious, the desired key to the problem would be an unconscious miracle. A miracle is irrational. Hence, the act is an unconscious, irrational happening, shaping itself without the assistance of reason and conscious purpose. It happens of itself. It just grows, like a phenomenon of creative nature, and not from any clever trick of human wit. It is the fruit of yearning expectation, of faith and hope. And so again, this is kind of Jung alluding to the transcendent function and um, the agentic role of the unconscious in um, precipitating the emergence of a new center of consciousness. And so, although the direction of the conscious will toward the unconscious in Jung is very important, like how we direct our conscious attitude, it is the kind of co-participating of conscious and unconscious that gives rise to this the transcendent function. And so this unconscious miracle aspect, like the irrational role, the role of the irrational, say, ends up being very important to Jung. But we're going to mostly leave that aside, and there's a couple of last pages that will help us to clarify what Jung means by intuition, sorry, sensation and intuition, yes, in terms of the Apollonian and Dionysian. So rather than talking about their reconciliation, we're going to stick with this split of opposites and talk about it in terms that Nietzsche's describing. So what Jung wants to get at is the psychological qualities of the Apollonian and Dionysian. So we're going to further discuss briefly, there's only 3 pages left, what exactly these two mean in terms of Jung's psychology. So firstly, again, we've talked more about the Dionysian already, and we're going to keep going with that before we get to the Apollonian. So what is meant by the Dionysian? Well, he quotes from Schiller, a poem to describe the Dionysian. Approach, ye millions, and embrace. To the whole world my kiss shall swell. All the world may draughts of joy from the breasts of nature take. Good and ill alike employ pains to trace joy's rosy wake. Kisses gave she and the grape, and the faithful lifelong friend. Even the worm its joy can shape. Heavenwards the cherubs wend. So this poem, according to Jung, sort of expresses this yeah, the quality of like Dionysian expansion. It's a yes, it's a quality of overpowering universal feeling which bursts forth irresistibly, intoxicating the senses like the strongest wine. This is why the Dionysian is connected with intoxication. It's this burst, it's this flooding, this affective flood um, of ecstasy. Yeah, and so like we can see from that that Jung regards in this state is clearly a function of sensation. It's a deeply um, yeah, it's a combination of sensation and affect, meaning sensing and feeling. Yeah. And so Jung regards it as an extroversion of all those feelings. It's like it's this taking these feelings and them going outward toward the object. And so for Jung, this combination of sensation and feeling is combined with extroversion in terms of the Dionysian state. It's an extroverted condition. Yeah, what breaks out in this state has more the character of pure affect, something instinctive and blindly compelling that finds specific expression in an affection of the bodily sphere. And so by contrast, now we talk about the Apollonian. And so Jung talks about this in terms of the like the perception of inner images of beauty, quote, of measure, of controlled and proportioned feelings. The comparison with dreaming clearly indicates the character of the Apollonian state. It's a state of introspection, of contemplation, turned inwards to the dream world of eternal ideas, hence to a state of introversion. So it's in a way, it's exactly the opposite of the Dionysian. It's very much a going in, so an introverted condition rather than going out towards the object. There's a quality of restraint. It's not so much about feeling as about abstraction and thinking. And there's a very much a sensation of control and measure, so purport rather than excess. Um, yeah, very much going inward and sort of imagery rather than action. So it's like inner perception of imagery rather than outward manifestation of embodied action. So it's mental rather than affective or physical. But Jung acknowledges that this, like drawing out these distinctions in terms of introversion and extroversion, and then in terms of like feeling and sensation is connected with extroversion, and we could say thinking and intuition in connection with uh, introversion and the Apollonian. This is in a way doing violence to Nietzsche's concepts. So this is a way that Jung is drawing more into and out from Nietzsche's concepts than Nietzsche really meant by them. So we're not entirely faithful to Nietzsche here. We're into Jung now, what Jung regards as the difference between the two. So one of the differences from Nietzsche's uh, conception of from Jung's is that, like, when we were talking about chapter two of psychological types, we made this sort of key distinction between, like, for example, realism and nominalism, where realism is sort of very much going up towards the abstract ideas in the Platonic sense, and nominalism is going up down towards the many actual objects rather than to the abstract ideas. And that distinction implies a key difference between thinking on the one hand, going up towards realism or abstraction to say, and going down in terms of feeling toward individual objects in terms of nominalism. And Jung is saying that Nietzsche's distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian has not yet reached the level of differentiation that Jung regards between, let's say, realism and nominalism. And so there's a way that it's not yet as differentiated. And for this reason, going up to the Apollonian has this combination of both thinking and intuition. So intuition has not yet been separated from thinking. And similarly, the Dionysian is this combination of, as well as feeling, sensation, which have not become distinguished yet from each other. So there's this non-differentiation between sensation and feeling in the Dionysian, and non-differentiation between thinking and intuition in terms of the Apollonian. And that's what allows it to be compared with like the Apollonian with dreaming on the one hand, which is very much this not just abstract thinking, but also um, um, perception of images, which is very more intuitional. And this is why the Dionysian can be considered a kind of intoxication because it's not just affective, it's also uh, sensuous or sensory. So Jung then wants to differentiate his own typology from this by saying, for example, that our modern functions, again, we have the types of introversion, extroversion, and four different functions, which correspond to eventually 16 different kinds of people in Jung. But what that means for Jung is that, like, in someone who um, in someone who's more introverted, the their ideas, namely, yeah, their introversion can be dominated by thinking or by feeling. So I'll quote Jung to be clear. In a man whose attitude is predominantly reflective, the Apollonian perception of inner images produces an elaboration of the perceived material in accordance with the nature of intellectual thinking. In other words, it produces ideas. In a man whose attitude is predominated by feeling, a similar process results, a feeling through of the images and the production of a feeling-toned idea, which may coincide in essentials with an idea produced by thinking. Ideas, therefore, are just as much feelings as thoughts, examples being the idea of the fatherland, freedom, God, immortality, etc. In both elaborations, the principle is a rational and logical one. Yeah, and so this is like Jung making clear that one can be introverted and like in Jungian terms, one's dominant function can be introverted and intuitive, and that can be characterized with like feeling can very much be present in the introverted type, and by extension, thinking can very much be present in the extroverted type. So we're not limited to this non-differentiation of sensation and feeling in Nietzsche and of thinking and intuition in Nietzsche. Jung then makes a further distinction. So he wants to talk about um, rational and irrational. And so he kind of connects this um, irrational standpoint in contrast to an aesthetic standpoint, which he regards as more irrational. And so Jung is saying, this is page 145, that in a sense, thinking and feeling kind of derive from rationalism, which has Apollonian qualities, whereas sensation and intuition seem to derive from an irrationalism, which has more Dionysian qualities, which is a more aesthetic standpoint. And so Jung regards the functions of thinking and feeling as belonging to kind of rational types, whereas the functions of sensation and intuition are belonging to more aesthetic types. Um, and like any of them can have these functions of, or any of them can be more introverted and extroverted. So I'm trying to clarify here. Previously, Jung's been talking about the difference between introversion and extroversion as connected with introversion and thinking, and extroversion and feeling. But he's now Jung making a further distinction, saying that um, the someone who's introverted doesn't have to be introverted in terms of thinking, and someone who's extroverted doesn't have to be extroverted in terms of feeling. By contrast, and both of those being sort of Apollonian rationalistic types. By contrast, someone who's introverted can be introverted in intuitive terms, and someone who's extroverted can be extroverted in terms of sensation, both of which Jung regards as kind of Dionysian irrational types. So he tries to clarify what each of these mean. He says, these are the intuitive and sensation types. Both of them have the mechanisms of introversion and extroversion in common with the rational types, thinking and feeling. But they do not, like the thinking type, differentiate the perception and contemplation of inner images into thought, nor, like the feeling type, differentiate the affective experience of instinct and sensation into feeling. On the contrary, the intuitive raises unconscious perception to the level of a differentiated function, by which he also achieves his adaptation to the world. He adapts by means of unconscious directives, which he receives through an especially sensitive and sharpened perception and interpretation of dimly conscious stimuli. It compares this quality to Socrates' daemon, although he argues that Socrates repressed the intuitive function as far as possible, so it had to make itself felt in the form of these concrete hallucinations, since it had no direct access to consciousness, which is not the case with the intuitive type. But the sensation type, by contrast, is the converse of the intuitive. So they rely almost exclusively on sense impressions. Their whole psychology is oriented by instinct and sensation, almost entirely dependent on external stimuli. Yeah, and so this kind of allows us to further clarify Jungian typology in terms of the Apollonian and Dionysian. So again, where we have the main types of introversion and extroversion, but then we have these rationalistic functions of thinking and feeling, which can apply to each. And those are both connected with the Apollonian. And in contrast, we have the more irrational or irrationalistic, that's not really a word though, types of more sensation and intuition that are connected with the Dionysian. And that is, again, more or less going to bring us to the end of chapter 3 of Jung's psychological types. The goal here was to clarify how Jung arrived at his conceptions of the types. And I have to say, it's still not very clear. Again, we might get later into. I think what's more interesting for me ultimately is his discussion of the transcendent function, and for which reason I am going to skip chapter 4, which I didn't find particularly interesting, and talk more, again, not wanting to hang my hat too much on Jungian typology. It's kind of just interesting to use as a framing of the split in Western consciousness. How does Jung then talk about the type problem in poetry in chapter 5, and what can Jungian typology reveal about the symbol of the self, the nature of the emerging center of consciousness, that I will discuss at a different time.